We followed the president's orders. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo. Everyone was in the loop.
You don't have records, you don't have your notes. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability.
Nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying aid to these investigations. Is that correct?
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question.
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States. We did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani. Simply put, we were playing the hand we were dealt. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose a very important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the president's orders. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. We made every effort to ensure that the relevant decision makers at the National Security Council and the State Department knew the important details of our efforts. The suggestion that we were engaged in some irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. I was first informed that the White House was withholding security aid to Ukraine during conversations with Ambassador Taylor on July 18th, 2019. However, as I testified before, I was never able to obtain a clear answer regarding the specific reason for the hold, whether it was bureaucratic in nature, which often happens, or reflected some other concern in the interagency process. In the absence of any credible explanation for the hold, I came to the conclusion that the aid, like the White House visit, was jeopardized. In preparation for the September 1 Warsaw meeting, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump and Zelensky would help to break the logjam.
In your deposition, you testified that you found yourself on a continuum that became more insidious over time. Can you describe what you mean by this continuum of insidiousness?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when we left the Oval Office, I believe on May 23rd, the request was very generic for an investigation of corruption in a very vanilla sense, and dealing with some of the oligarch problems in Ukraine, which were long-standing problems. And then as time went on, more specific items got added to the menu, including the Burisma and 2016 election meddling specifically, the DNC server specifically, and over this continuum, it became more and more difficult to secure the White House meeting because more conditions were being placed on the White House meeting.
You confirmed to President Trump that you were in Ukraine at the time and that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass, unquote. Do you recall saying that?
Yeah, it sounds like something I would say. That's how President Trump and I communicate, a lot of four-letter words. In this case, three-letter.
Holmes then said that he heard President Trump ask, quote, is he, meaning Zelensky, going to do the investigation? To which you replied, he's going to do it. And then you added that President Zelensky will do anything that you, meaning President Trump, ask him to. Do you recall that?
I probably said something to that effect because I remember the meeting, President Zelensky was very, solicitous is not a good word. He was just very willing to work with the United States and was being very amicable. And so putting it in Trump speak by saying he loves your ass, he'll do whatever you want, meant that he would really work with us on a whole host of issues.
He was not only willing, he was very eager, right?
That's fair.
Because Ukraine depends on the United States as its most significant ally. Isn't that correct?
One of its most, absolutely.
You testified that this was a quid pro quo. Is that right?
I did.
And you, at this point, by the end of August, knew that the aid had been held up for at least 6 weeks. Is that correct?
I believe I found out through Ambassador Taylor that the aid had been held up around July 18th is when I heard originally.
And even though you searched for reasons, you were never given a credible explanation. Is that right?
That's right.
And no one you spoke to thought that the aid should be held, to your knowledge. Is that right?
I never heard anyone advocate for holding the aid.
And now, by this point, at the end of August, it went public and the Ukrainians knew about it, right?
I believe there was some press reports, presuming or who knows, but I think at that point it became sort of common knowledge that everything might be tied together.
And in fact, President Zelensky brought it up at that September 1st meeting with Vice President Pence that you were at, right?
I don't know if he brought it up specifically, but asked where the aid was, I think was more, I think he sort of asked, again, very vague recollection, because I don't have a readout of the bilateral meeting, but why don't I have my check, essentially?
And you understood the Ukrainians received no credible explanation. Is that right?
I certainly couldn't give them one.
So is this kind of a 2 + 2 = 4 conclusion that you reached?
Pretty much.
Is the only logical conclusion to you that, given all of these factors, that the aid was also a part of this quid pro quo?
Yep. President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the meetings. The only thing we got directly from Giuliani was that the Burisma and 2016 elections were conditioned on the White House meeting. The aid was my own personal, guess, based, again, on your analogy, 2 + 2 = 4.
You testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president, correct?
That's our understanding, yes.
But how did you know that? Who told you?
Well, when the president says, talk to my personal attorney, and then Mr. Giuliani, as his personal attorney, makes certain requests or demands, we assume it's coming from the president. I'm not testifying that I heard the president tell Mr. Giuliani to tell us, so if that's your question.
Right, but at your deposition, you said the question was at the May 23rd meeting when the president said, go talk to Rudy. You responded, he didn't even say go talk. He said, talk to Rudy. You subsequently said it was sort of like, I don't want to talk about this. So it wasn't an order or a direction to go talk with Mr. Giuliani, correct?
Our conclusion, and the conclusion of the three of us, was that if we did not talk to Rudy, nothing would move forward on Ukraine.
You acknowledge that this is speculation, right?
It was a presumption.
Okay. That it was a guess. In fact, I think you even said this morning.
Well, I want to say that it goes back to Mr. Goldman's point, or Chairman Schiff's, 2 + 2 = 4 in my mind at that point.
Okay, but you didn't have any evidence of that, correct?
Other than the aid wasn't being released and we weren't getting anywhere with the Ukrainians.
Okay, but did Ambassador Volker clue you in that was the issue? I mean, this is a pretty high, this is a pretty serious conclusion you've reached without precise evidence.
Well, I sent that email to Secretary Pompeo to set up a potential meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky in Warsaw. And when I referred to the logjam, I referred to the logjam in a very inclusive way. Everything was jammed up at that point, and Secretary Pompeo essentially gave me the green light to brief President Zelensky about making those announcements.
you don't have records, you don't have your notes, because you didn't take notes, you don't have a lot of recollections. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability. Isn't that true?
Well, what I'm trying to do today is to use the limited information I have to be as forthcoming as possible with you and the rest of the committee. And as these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
correct.
And including the Secretary of State.
Correct.
Now, have you seen the Acting Chief of Staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later, yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming he was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because
And he said yes it was, did he not?
he said yes it was.
The call with President Trump on September 9th or the 8th, you recall it vividly, right?
I recall it vividly because it was keyed by the sort of frantic emails from Ambassador Taylor. I had, again, prior to that call, had all kinds of theories as to why things weren't moving, why there was no White House meeting, why there was no aid, why there was no this, why there was no that. And I was getting tired of going around in circles, frankly. So I made the call, and I asked, as I said, the open-ended question, what do you want from Ukraine? And that's when I got the answer.
He was unequivocal, nothing.
What I said in the text is what I heard.
And I'm curious, was that vignette in your opener today?
I don't think so.
How come? That's so memorable, so striking.
I don't know. It was in my previous testimony, and I assumed if people had questions, they would bring it up.
Okay. I mean, this is an example, a lot of witnesses during the course of this investigation have dealt with ambiguities in different ways, and some have resolved them in the light least favorable to the president over and over again. This is an exculpatory fact shedding some light on the president's state of mind about the situation about the,
And I'm happy to discuss it.
Is that your testimony today, Ambassador Sondland, that you have evidence that Donald Trump tied the investigations to the aid? Because I don't think you're saying that.
I've said repeatedly, Congressman, I was presuming. I also said that President Trump...
So no one told you, not just the president. Giuliani didn't tell you, Mulvaney didn't tell you, nobody, Pompeo didn't tell you, nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying aid to these investigations. Is that correct?
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question. Is it correct? No one on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying this aid to the investigations? Because if your answer is yes, then the chairman's wrong and the headline on CNN is wrong. No one on this planet told you that President Trump was tying aid to investigations. Yes or no?
Yes.
So, you really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations.
Other than my own presumption.
My colleagues seem to be under the impression that unless the president spoke the words, Ambassador Sondland, I am bribing the Ukrainian president, that there's no evidence of bribery. If he didn't say, Ambassador Sondland, I'm telling you I'm not going to give the aid unless they do this, that there's no evidence of a quid pro quo on military aid. But nonetheless, Ambassador, you've given us a lot of evidence of precisely that conditionality of both the White House meeting and the military assistance. Now, they also seem to say that, well, they got the money. The money may have been conditioned, but they got the money. Yes, they got caught. They got caught. Now, they still don't have the White House meeting. They made no statement. They got no meeting. The statement on the investigations was the condition to get the meeting. They didn't make the statement. They got no meeting. But they got caught. You're aware, aren't you, Ambassador, that 2 days before the aid was lifted, this inexplicable aid was lifted, Congress announced it was investigating this scheme. You're aware of that, aren't you, Ambassador?
I am now, yes.
You testified that you never received any direct confirmation or specific information as to why there was a hold on aid.
That's correct.
And in fact, you testified, quote, President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, end quote.
That's correct.
You said, quote, never heard those words from the president, correct?
Correct.
Instead, you testified that in your September 9th call with President Trump, the president said, quote, no quid pro quo. I want nothing. I want nothing. I want President Zelensky to do the right thing, do what he ran on, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fact is, the aid was given to Ukraine without any announcement of new investigations.
That's correct.
And President Trump did, in fact, meet with President Zelensky in September at the United Nations, correct?
He did.
And there was no announcement of investigations before this meeting?
Correct.
And there was no announcement of investigations after this meeting?
That's right.
Based on recommendations from me and other key DoD advisors, the Department of Defense, in coordination with the Department of State, certified in May 2019 that Ukraine had, quote, taken substantial actions to make defense institutional reforms for the purposes of decreasing corruption, increasing accountability, and sustaining improvements of combat capability, unquote, meriting obligation of the entire $250 million in USAI funds. In July, I became aware of a hold being placed on obligation of the State Department's Foreign Military Financing, or FMF, and DoD's USAI funds. In a series of interagency meetings, I heard that the President had directed the Office of Management and Budget to hold the funds because of his concerns about corruption in Ukraine. On July 25th, a member of my staff got a question from a Ukraine embassy contact asking what was going on with Ukraine security assistance.
The same day, President Trump spoke with President Zelensky on the phone and asked for this favor. The same day that President Zelensky thanked the United States for its military support and signaled it was ready to purchase more javelins. On that date, you got inquiries, your staff got inquiries from someone at the Ukrainian embassy who was concerned about the status of the military assistance. Is that correct?
Sir, that's correct. I would say that specifically the Ukrainian embassy staff asked what is going on with Ukrainian security assistance.
And did that connote to you that they were concerned that something was in fact going on with it?
Yes, sir.
And your staff or one of the other department staff also heard in August additional inquiries from the Ukraine embassy about a potential holdup in the military assistance?
Sir, I want to be careful about how I phrase this. My staff recall having had meetings with Ukrainian embassy representatives during the month of August, and they believe that the topic came up at some point during those meetings, but they don't recall the precise date or specifically what the nature of the discussion was.
But your staff at least gleaned from those conversations that the Ukrainian embassy was aware that there was some kind of a hold on the assistance.
So the way I would phrase it is that there was some kind of an issue, yes.
Is it fair to say that in the Trump administration, U.S. aid is withheld from foreign countries for a number of factors?
Correct.
And you've testified in your prior testimony that it is normal to have delays on aid.
I may have said it that way, but it is certainly an occurrence. It does occur.
In the past year, Ukraine was not the only country to have aid withheld from it. Is that correct?
Correct.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Pakistan?
Yes, sir.
And in the past year, was aid also withheld from Honduras?
Aid was withheld from the three states in northern Central America, yes.
In the past year, was aid withheld from Lebanon?
Yes, sir.
And when aid was first withheld from Lebanon, were you given a reason why it was withheld?
No.
So having no explanation for why aid is being withheld is not uncommon.
I would say it is not the normal way that we function.
But does happen.
It does happen.
When Congress authorized this money, it built in conditions, just as Mr. Ratcliffe suggested. By law, Ukraine wouldn't get all the money until it demonstrated that it had undertaken substantial anti-corruption reforms. Ms. Cooper, under the law, the Department of Defense works with the State Department and other agencies to establish anti-corruption benchmarks and determine whether Ukraine has sufficiently met those benchmarks, correct?
That's correct. That provision pertains to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative.
And that's a legally specified process. That's not the president in the Oval Office manifesting a general skepticism of foreign aid, right? That's
Sir,
a process.
It is a congressionally mandated process, yes, sir.
So by the time President Trump froze the aid, the Department of Defense had spent weeks, if not months, determining that the Ukrainian government met every requirement in the law and made significant strides in combating corruption. Is that correct?
That is correct. We made that determination in May.
My colleagues in the minority asked Mr. Hale, isn't it common to have holds on military aid? And I think you said they're not unusual. Would you agree, though, that it would be very unusual to place a hold on military aid in order to leverage a foreign country to get them to investigate a political opponent?
Yes.
And I take it you would agree that that would be completely inappropriate?
That would be inconsistent with the conduct of our foreign policy in general.
And it would also be wrong, wouldn't it?
Certainly not what I would do.
When we talk about aid, I always think about these are hard-earned taxpayer dollars. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And isn't it correct that this administration, the Trump administration, has been conducting a foreign assistance review to reestablish norms that guide the assistance as we provide aid overseas?
That's correct.
You testified that this review had been going on for quite a while, and the administration did not want to take a business-as-usual approach to foreign assistance, a feeling that once a country has received a certain assistance package, it's something that continues forever. And you continued, the program had to be evaluated that they were actually worthy beneficiaries of our assistance, that our program made sense, that we avoid nation-building strategies, and that we provide assistance to countries that are lost in terms of our policy to our adversaries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you testified that you warmly welcomed this assistance review.
Correct.
And again, just to get this on record and for the millions of Americans viewing, security assistance was in fact released to Ukraine. I know I've already asked this, but this is a really important point.
Correct.
Thank you. I yield back.